My name is Christina, and I will be talking to you today about ending and identifying and a little more information about destructive relationships. So I welcome you and I applaud you for taking the initial step to start to learn more about this topic. I'm sure that this is a topic that is not easy to explore, particularly when it involves yourself and the dynamics around your family, your friends, or any other environment in which you might find some sort of destructiveness within a relationship. So just to give you a little idea of how this is going to run, I'm going to go over some slides so you'll see my picture minimize in a minute or two. And I'm going to go through some things. I'm going to talk about some concepts and some ways in which you could work through some skills that you can use to end some of these destructive relationships or tools to identify them. And then I'm going to leave about a few minutes towards the end for you to ask any questions that you might have. So if you have a piece of paper or a pen or something that you want to jot down, some ideas, thoughts, or questions you might have while I go through the material, please feel free to do so. And then there will be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end, okay? So you're going to see me minimize in a minute, and you're going to see my PowerPoint pop up. I hope this is helpful. I know personally for me, when I'm learning, I like to have the discussion, but then also have some sort of visual tool. That's just how I like to learn, and I retain information that way. So I hope that this is helpful for you. And I also welcome any feedback, anything that might be helpful in future webinars, including other topics. So please feel free to enter that into the end if you have any ideas or things that were helpful, things that you might want to see in the future. I welcome that as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'm hoping you can still, there we go. Okay, so you can still see me, but I'm going to go into these slides, okay? So welcome again to Ending Destructive Relationships. I just want to remind you guys that this webinar is for informational purposes only. So I'm not doing any diagnosing. I'm not talking about any sort of specific treatments in this webinar. This is just sort of an overview of the concept and some sort of ideas to hope enlighten you to maybe, if you are struggling with a destructive relationship, to maybe work through it, or if you feel like you need assistance, to maybe reach out to a mental health practitioner locally for you. So please keep that in mind, and I would be glad to help with those resources later on in the question and answer portion. If you do feel like that's something you require, please reach out, okay? So let's talk about how we define relationships. Most often, when I talk about a relationship, the assumption is that I'm talking about a romantic relationship. However, there are various types of relationships in our lives. So there are friendships, right? So those people who might have been lifelong friends that we've been friends with since we were toddlers in school, who come hell or high water are there for us through college, through children, through marriages, whatever that is, right? Our friendships that we are just, are part of our everyday life. There are romantic partners, right? So the relationships that involve a significant other, work relationships, so bosses, co-workers, supervisors, anyone who's in that environment with you at your work, family relationships, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, anyone in that dynamic. And then I left a category for acquaintances or miscellaneous, because there are other people that we come across in our lives that may not necessarily fit the category of a friendship, like someone who we've had lifelong, but are significant enough in our life to fit in that category. We may hang out with them, we may see them occasionally throughout the week or frequently, but they fit in the category of sort of like miscellaneous friends, right? So people who are miscellaneous relationships in our life. So keep that in mind, because when I go through these slides, I want you to try and think of this in a global point of view, okay? You're going to hear me make some references as some examples, but any of the skills and the things that we talk about here will apply to these categories and more if they pertain to you. So, think about this in a global context and how it will impact you, okay? So why are relationships important? Now, we as human beings, right, long to have relationships with others, okay? It's innate within our development. So relationships, this is just a few examples of the reasons why we long for those relationships. First one we want to talk about is emotional well-being. Now, when you have a healthy, stable relationship, that relationship can provide a huge amount of stress relief for you, right? Maybe it's a partner who helps, with the day-to-day functioning of your household, or maybe it's your best friend who is there for you if you're struggling and having a bad day that you could reach out to and that you can communicate with. So healthy relationships in our lives are really important things. And there's something that we probably don't realize how significant they are in the day-to-day, because there's almost an expectation that these individuals are in our lives and that they will be there. That's a healthy relationship. Healthy relationships also tend to increase our healthy habits. So if we're engaged in a healthy relationship with someone, maybe that someone is a really good influence on us and helps us regulate our self-care, like gym and diet and exercise, right? And so by being involved in a healthy relationship, the hope is that our healthy behavioral patterns and habits will fall in line with them as well. And a healthy relationship could also lead to mood boosting, right? So if you're in a healthy relationship with someone, you're doing fun things, you're engaging in healthy habits, most likely healthy emotions and mood boosting emotions are going to also follow, right? You're going to feel better. You're going to, feel energized. Maybe you'll get better rest. You'll take care of yourself, right? Your self-care will likely increase if you're engaging in healthy relationships. The second one is shared experiences. So when you're engaging in a healthy relationship, chances are you've become, if short of family, right? You're born into family per se. And there is truth to also that sometimes friends become family, right? So remember, keep that general view in terms of these concepts. So most people are engaging with people in their life because they share some sort of experience with them, right? Maybe they have similar interests. Maybe they met engaging in a similar interest. Maybe they realized along the way at a work environment, wow, this person had a lot in common with me, and that developed into a healthy relationship. So lots of shared experiences and similarities, right? So that creates a sense of belonging. When you engage with someone who has shared experiences, that tells yourself, wow, I belong in this situation. Other people sort of support what my thoughts and feelings are. So this is a great person to have in my life. Okay, so shared experience also create a support system, right? So if you're with someone, like we'll go back to the gym example, if you're having a really bad day and you're not feeling like working out that day, turning to your support system, turning to your healthy relationship might get you back on track and support you to make sure you get that self-care in for that day, right? Or you stick to your diet, or you follow up on those day-to-day tasks at home that you might be struggling with. So they could be a really good support for you. And with that support and that sense of belonging tends to come a strong sense of trust. So when you're engaging in a healthy relationship and all these things are playing, you're opening yourself to this other person in this dynamic of a healthy relationship, and you're establishing trust. Trust not only with certain aspects of your life, and it may actually be trust, maybe it's a friend that you can rely on to pick up your child from school that day, right? It's also emotional trust. You tend to open yourself up to these strong relationships because there is a sense of trust there. And you understand that this person will take those thoughts and emotions that you're expressing with them and take care of them and not abuse them or hurt you with them. Okay, and third, mostly involving probably work or more professional categories here, are common goals, right? So if you're at work and you're in a healthy relationship, you're going to be involved in, that person's going to be a team player. You guys are going to work towards common goals, common solutions, okay? And you're going to try to resolve things in a middle ground team approach. And then there's also involving in a domestic partnership. If you're in a healthy relationship within your domestic partnership, the hope there is that you guys will be able to work together to create whatever and however you define that partnership at home, and it will be equal, it will be balanced, and you guys will be successful achieving those common goals. Okay, so in a healthy relationship, keep that in mind. These are the general things that are important for people when they're seeking healthy relationships. Okay, so when do they turn destructive? So let's look at our little picture that I have here that says, what is communication? Okay. So the reason why I wanted to put up this picture about communication is because I really feel strongly that communication is the cornerstone of any relationship. Okay. Whether it's a destructive one, it's one that might have started off good, that is leading towards a destructive phase, or it's a healthy one. Communication is key. So I just want you to take a minute to sort of look at these things, right? So it's giving you the verbal, which are those little white circles about how people are communicating verbally, but it's also showing you some of the nonverbal the reasons why all the nonverbal stuff is important as well. And all those, so if you look at sender, message, feedback, interpretation, meaning, receiver, that's sort of what your brain does in a conversation when you're communicating without even knowing it, right? So that's, your brain is automatically functioning and it's doing this thing on its own and you're not even really realizing because it's so automatic, okay? But when this breakdown occurs and communication isn't as fluid like this diagram shows, that's when relationships can really suffer. Okay, so someone who's in a destructive relationship, poor communication might look like a one-sided thing, right? So maybe that individual is the person who is always, maybe you're the person who's always expressing yourself to the other individual, but you don't feel like that they're acknowledging you. You don't feel like that they're listening to you. And you feel like that they aren't really taking ownership of their role in that relationship as someone who can help support you. Okay, they could also be invalidating. So this might be the person who might be doing other tasks while you're communicating yourself, or saying, no, you're crazy. The way that you're feeling, that you're wrong, right? So they're not saying, wow, I understand where you're coming from. Let me help you kind of work through this or find other alternatives to help solve this problem, right? So they're giving you that misperception that what you're feeling and what you're thinking is not true. Okay. And the last part in terms of what this might look like in poor communication is what we call walking on eggshells. So that's the relationship that you kind of don't know what to say to this individual, because in 1 minute you could say something and they're fine, and then in another minute you could say something and it completely derails them emotionally and it upsets them. So think about that in your head. Like, what would it feel like to walk on eggshells? You're slowly trying to avoid these eggshells because you don't know when it's going to crack. So a destructive relationship with poor communication can feel like that in many instances. Okay. So in terms of loss of self, a person who's engaging in a destructive relationship might really struggle with their sense of self. Okay. So you might stop doing things you love. Maybe you're not talking to family members. Maybe you're not seeing your friends at the end of your workday because you're so emotionally exhausted from your day at work with a destructive supervisor that you can't even muster the energy to even pick up a phone and talk to your support systems, okay? You stop doing your self-care. You stop going to the gym. You stop taking care of your diet, right? Or, maybe you're turning to poor diet as a means to self-soothe some of those emotions you're feeling because you have so much stress with that supervisor at work because that relationship is destructive. And as a result of that, you might also start to feel isolated. So you start to pull away from some of the things in your life because you're so overwhelmed in this relationship that's become destructive that either you don't have the emotional energy to continue in other areas of your life, or maybe you're embarrassed if it's an abusive or domestic violence type of situation, or maybe that person has made you feel so bad about yourself that you just don't want to be around people and you're isolating. Okay, so that might be what some of the characteristics if you're talking about loss of self in a destructive relationship. And dependency. So maybe there's a dynamic that's created where you feel like you've lost a sense of being able to problem solve on your own. You've lost the ability to say, hey, this is a situation that I could figure out. And instead, you rely on this other person to solve your problems or to act as sort of your brain, your knowledge, versus you kind of taking a step back and trying to figure out the solution on your own. So you've kind of lost that confidence in that area. And lastly, power and control or power dynamics. So in many cases involving a destructive relationship, there is some form of manipulation or coercion that's occurring. Okay, so either that person has has seen a part of your personality that they see that maybe they could manipulate for their benefit. So maybe you're a really caring and giving person, and at work, someone doesn't feel like doing a task, but because they know that you're really motivated and you're a go-getter, maybe they'll start to sort of ask you to do things slowly, and then they'll see if you do it. And then when you follow through, maybe the next week they'll ask you about more. And so over time, they've sort of groomed you or manipulated or coerced you into doing things for their benefit versus acknowledging your needs and perhaps how it's impacting you. So think about that in all those realms of your life, whether it's family, friends, romantic relationships, work. These are some of the concepts and some of the ways in which destructive relationships could be playing out in your life today. So what are some things that you can use to help identify these destructive relationships? Sometimes they're really hard to identify. Sometimes we may use what we call thinking errors, right? And things that we tell ourselves, we're going to get into that moment. The things that we tell ourselves to say, trick ourselves to say, I know this relationship is bad, but I'm going to stay anyway. So the first thing I could offer you in trying to identify them is make a list of pros and cons. It's really that simple. If you sit down and you write a list of pros and cons of the relationship, in theory, if you have a healthy relationship, there should be balance, right? So there should be give and take within the relationship. There should be a feeling that I'm giving equally as I'm receiving. So if you're sitting down and you're doing this pros and cons list and you find that you're the one who's predominantly giving lots of things to this relationship and you're not receiving a lot back, and your pro list is really small and your con list is really high, then maybe that might be one signal that this relationship might not be healthy for you. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the be all end all, but we're talking about some signs and some things that you can use to sort of identify it. So keep that in mind. Really simple skill, can be used in lots of realms of your life, might be helpful. Okay. So in turn, you might want to also look at, do you give more than you get? Now I have two examples of that here. So we'll talk about financially, because there are some destructive relationships where finances and money do come into play. So there can be relationships when maybe you're going out and you're the one who's always paying for things or engaging in some sort of monetary transaction, dinner, hanging out, rent, bills, whatever that is. So maybe you're giving more to that relationship financially than the other person. So sit back and think about that. Is that a potential sign that maybe this relationship is imbalanced and it's potentially destructive for me in the long term? And how about emotionally, right? So maybe this person is constantly leaning on you for emotional support, but when you're the one who's ready to turn to them because you need some support, they're nowhere to be found, or they're disengaging from the conversation, or maybe they're not available. So if there's some emotional signs that you're receiving from that other individual, that there's no balance there, okay, and you're giving more to them than they're giving back to you. Again, that balance. If you think about sort of a scale, you want them to be equal. You don't want one to be higher than the other. And like we talked about a little earlier, are you using excuses to stay? So common when I hear most often in treatment is, but they'll change. I'm hoping they'll change. Things will get better. Now, while there may be some relationships where that is true and there can be growth and there can be change, I would be careful about using that across the board as an excuse to validate the fact that you're staying in a destructive relationship. So really examine that and say, is this an excuse I'm making, or are there actual steps that we can put into place to improve this relationship? Are there things that can be fixed, things that can be communicated, so this relationship can actually be effective for me? If the answer is no, and you identify that it's more of an excuse thing that you're telling yourself, then maybe think about this being a destructive relationship for you. So when we are caught up in destructive emotion, we lose one of our greatest assets, our independence. Could not be more true. Okay? Sometimes in a destructive relationship, you can become enmeshed with that individual, meaning you lose contact with things you love and care about. So all of your priorities, things that you once loved, things that you once loved doing might go out the window because you're so involved with this destructive relationship that the relationship monopolizes your life and all those other things disappear. So those other things could be family, right? They could be friends. They could be your self-care, your health needs, anything that falls under that category, because what it's creating is a dynamic in which what things that are important to you are no longer existing, because this is creating so much destruction in your life. Excuse me. It's creating so much destruction in your life that it's the only thing. It's consuming all areas, okay? And of course, if there's any emotional or physical abuse going on in any of your relationships, please seek proper help in terms of that. I've included the domestic abuse hotline in case anyone needs it. But if you are experiencing emotional or physical abuse, there are many people who are out there who can help you not only manage getting out of that relationship, but also to support you after that happens. So I really encourage, if that's something that you're struggling with right now, to maybe take that opportunity to seek out someone who could assist you, okay? Now, maybe in a destructive relationship, you're maybe drinking more, engaging in drugs, shopping, gambling, right? So any sort of poor lifestyle choice that under circumstances without this individual, you might not see yourself engaging in or might have never engaged in, but because this individual is now part of your life and part of your circle, you find yourself doing some things that you're like, wait a second, this isn't who I am, okay? So if you find that is happening within this relationship, then that's another red flag, right? If you don't feel like you're being your genuine self, or you're being a little more risky, or you're pushing boundaries where you're not necessarily a person who would push boundaries and like to follow rules and like to stick to certain routines, then that's a potential red flag that this relationship is probably destructive for you. And again, damaged self-esteem. So if you're engaging in a relationship and that you notice that you're talking more negatively about yourself, you're questioning your appearance, your weight, your goals in life, your intelligence, who you are, any sort of sense of self that might be starting to become negative, and you start to question who you are or some of your priorities, keep an eye on that, because if that self-esteem is starting to change and you're struggling with that in the context of this relationship, that's a really strong red flag that this might be a destructive one for you. So what are some common thinking errors that I hear? And when I say thinking errors, I just mean sort of things that people tell themselves that trick their brain into thinking something's true when it might not be. That I talk with people in my sessions with about in terms of destructive relationships are common when I hear a bad relationship is better than no relationship mentality, right? So there are many people, and I completely understand it, especially in the context of what we've all been experiencing for the last almost a year with coronavirus and the quarantine. There are many people who are very scared to be alone, or maybe have never experienced being alone. Maybe if they're the type of person in a romantic relationship who have gone from partner to partner to partner, or from home to partner to partner to partner. So they've never really had that experience of being by themselves. So unfortunately, even if they go through all of these things, they see all these red flags we've talked about, and they've identified that it's a destructive relationship, they may stay in the relationship because they feel that even though it's bad, it's better than being alone. So if you've ever had that thought to yourself and you feel like that's a situation you're in, that might be a thinking error that you're telling yourself, when in reality, you're in a relationship that probably should no longer be in your life. Okay? While it may be scary for you to be alone, that's a skill set that you could work on to have more confidence and gain more confidence in being by yourself or being independent, versus putting yourself in a situation that is not healthy for you, that is actually decreasing your health, emotional well-being over time. Okay? Again, you see poor self-esteem. Okay? Common theme here. A relationship that is destructive will slowly chisel away at an individual's self-esteem. Okay? Because it's questioning all these things. Like I said earlier, your thoughts about self, who you are, you lose that independence, you lose that confidence. So as people lose that independence and as people lose that confidence, okay, that self-esteem comes. And so maybe they start to think, well, I'll never find another job. I'll never find another group of friends, even though I know that these friends are the wrong friends for me. Or this relationship, it's not really a partner that I see myself with forever, but I'm not good enough for anyone else. So those type of thoughts should be red flags that maybe you're engaging in a destructive relationship. Another thinking area here, I can change them. So like I said earlier, there may be some situations that people can change and you can move forward with the proper support. But if you find yourself constantly seeing that and making efforts to make change or to verbalize to this individual that you think there should be change coming, and that person is not willing to make any changes or work with you there, another red flag that you might be in a destructive relationship. Okay? Children and dependence. Maybe people are engaged in destructive relationships because there are children or other people that depend on them. So they will sacrifice themselves to and their emotions and their well-being for these individual, which is admirable. And I understand there are some situations where that is important. But if it is a relationship that you feel like, oh, there's no way I can get out of that, then at least you should be able to identify that this may be destructive for you, because hopefully you can get some support. And maybe there are other avenues that you can go down that might help you with this. So eventually, maybe not immediately, you could disconnect from this destructive relationship. And along with that comes finances, right? You know, we see this a lot in sort of a domestic partner destructive relationship where there's fighting, there's cheating, there's drugs, there's alcohol. But at the end of the day, people stay together because they feel that, well, then maybe they can't support themselves. They're relying on the two incomes. So instead of making steps to be more effective and problem solve that solution, they stay engaged in this destructive relationship, even though they're suffering emotionally, mentally, and health-wise, because they're not looking or they're not able to look for alternate problem-solving strategies. Okay? And then lastly, a dynamic of abuse. So like I said earlier, if you're struggling with emotional, verbal, physical, any sort of domestic abuse, that dynamic is a very difficult and challenging one. And sometimes the dynamic makes it very hard for victims of domestic abuse to see the reality versus the misperception as a result of that abuse. So please, again, if you need assistance with that, please reach out to a domestic violence hotline and a specialist who can really help you work through that, find yourself a safe solution to get yourself in a better relationship and in a better dynamic, okay? So now that we've talked about a lot of these things and things that you might see in terms of destructive relationships, how do you let them go? The hardest part, how do you let them go? Now, I'm not saying that this is an easy thing for you to do or that it's going to happen right away. I'm just giving you some sort of skills that might be helpful, that might come to mind when you've identified, wait a second, this may not be a healthy relationship for me. This sounds like destructive. So what are some things that you can use once you've identified a destructive relationship in your life to help sort of move past it or disengage from it? So the first thing I would recommend is that you examine your motivation and your emotion. So if you're identifying a relationship in your life as destructive, I would identify your emotional temperature. So am I just really emotional about this and we got into a fight with my supervisor, so now my emotions are stronger than my rational, my thinking? What's the facts of the situation? So is this the best time for me to really be evaluating whether this relationship is healthy for me or not? Again, emotional temperature, where are you? Making sure that your emotions are not running that behavior. And you really thought about all these things and came to a conclusion. Now, of course, if it's an emergency situation, that's a different story. But these are the more day-to-day sort of destructive relationships in which you're able to take that time to say, okay, let me really examine what's going on. And what are my needs? What are my needs within this relationship? And are they being met? Okay, so that's the first step. How to let them go. Make yourself a priority. Your emotions are a priority. Your needs are a priority. Can this be helped with further support? So if you've identified a relationship that may be destructive or has some destructive tendencies, there are some relationships that can be helped, right? Maybe that could be through the use of therapy, whether that's family or couple therapy or individual therapy, if maybe you've identified something within you that you'd like to work on. Maybe you have a relationship that, is struggling because of addiction. So maybe you're with someone or you have a work partner who you recognize is really good on the day-to-day. But once they start drinking or they use drugs or they gamble or whatever that is, it completely changes who they are, and that ruins your relationship. So maybe having some sort of addiction treatment for that individual might be helpful and could actually resolve some of those issues. And lastly, sometimes in terms of destructive relationships, it breaks down to what we said earlier about poor communication and problem solving. So if you are able to identify strategies to improve those communication issues or improve that problem solving, then maybe some of the issues within that destructive relationship could be resolved and it could be an effective one. So keep that in mind, that even if you identify a destructive relationship, there may be some tools that you can use to improve it. So before you let them go, a couple of things I just want to remind you of that I find really helpful to talk about. And it all falls under this category of preparing yourself. Now, you've gone through this process, you've identified destructive relationship, you've said, okay, I don't think there's much that I can do in terms of other ways to support it and improve it. So now I need to disengage from the relationship. So preparing yourself is one of the best things you can do, okay? Of course, if it's an emergency situation and you need to get out, you need to get out. Your safety is first. But if it's a relationship that you could actually work through disengaging from, these are some of the skills that you might want to explore. So first, I would identify your obstacles. So problem solve them to the best of your ability. What does that mean? So what are some obstacles to you disengaging from a relationship? Maybe you're scared to leave a job with an abusive boss because you're worried you won't be able to pay your bills, you won't be able to pay your rent, right? Or maybe you're scared to leave an abusive partner because you have no place else to go. Okay, so identifying some of those obstacles can help you prepare for them. And once you identify them, you can hopefully solve them to the best of your ability. This way, when you do make that decision to end that relationship, you're not overrun with all of this anxiety. You've planned for it, okay? So what is your plan to manage the emotions during and after you exit your relationship? As you've identified a destructive relationship in your life, that's going to bring up a certain set of emotions as you prepare to terminate that relationship with that individual. And then after you do so, there'll be another set of emotions. So make sure you have a plan, a healthy plan to navigate that for you as you're going through the process. That may be self-care. That may be a healthy support contact. That might be therapy if you feel like you need it. Whatever that healthy plan is for you, make sure there's a plan in place. So when it does happen, you're not completely derailed by all of those emotions and don't feel overcome by all those emotions, okay? Because that could lead to very destructive behavior even within yourself. Examine consequences of leaving the relationship. Why is that important? If you can sort of think about what might be some consequences of leaving this relationship, you can prepare for them, and you'll be better at navigating them in the future. So if you can say, okay, well, if I leave work, I need to have 3 months worth of savings saved up so I could pay my rent. So maybe you delay leaving work for another 2 months or so you have that preparation. Or maybe it's a family dynamic that's really challenging for you and you wish to move out of that home. Preparing and saving finances to prepare yourself to set up to moving that home. So what are some consequences? What are some things that you can do, and how can you navigate them in the future? Now, I say identify your support system, but what I should have said is identify your positive support system, right? So who are the people in your life that without a doubt are positive influences on you and positive supports for you? Identify who they are and let them know what's going on. If you tell them that you're struggling with this destructive relationship in your life and you want to get out of it or you want to disengage with it, there's a chance that not only could they have really good information for you on how to do that, they will also be there to help support you when you do it. So they can be part of that exit plan, right? What's your plan once it's done? How do I move past it? And where do I go? Okay, so reach out to those positive support systems. And sometimes when we're in a destructive relationship, it's hard to admit it to ourselves, but also to others, right? It's hard to admit about things that we struggle with to other people, but a positive support system for you, a positive person in your life will be there regardless and will be there to support it. So, reach out to them and let them know what's going on. They could be a huge resource for you. And rehearse. It sounds funny, but have a plan on what to say, whether that's a journal, whether that's writing out a script. You might not stick to it in the moment and you might not use it, but the idea here is that you're practicing those thoughts. So when you're in the moment, you're not overwhelmed with emotion and you're not steering off course by what people might be saying to you in that dynamic as you're leaving the relationship. You're focused on things that you want to say. You're confident in those things. You've prepared your thoughts and you've prepared your actions. Because when you have a plan and when you've rehearsed it, theoretically, right, you're more confident. And when you go into a situation to terminate a destructive relationship, the more confidence you have, the stronger you will be, and the higher probability you will have that you will follow it through. Okay? And moving forward, okay? So now that you've identified a destructive relationship, we've talked about reasons why people are in them, we've talked about some ways to get out them. How do you move forward? So first thing, and the most difficult thing I'd say I'd advise, is that you examine your patterns. Go back and think about in your life, do you sort of end up in similar dynamics in your relationship? Do you seek out a certain partner? Do you get involved with friends who are the same type of personality or do the same risky behaviors? Or at work, do you tend to choose a job for certain reasons that might not be in your best interest? So I would go back and examine your patterns, because if you see a pattern of certain things that you tend to engage in, maybe you can use some skills or make some differences in your life to make the situation more effective for you in the future and to avoid destructive relationships in the future, which really is the ultimate goal. And lastly, find some pathways to healing. So once you find yourself exiting this relationship, it could come with really strong emotions and loss and hurt and anxiety and depression, particularly if it involved abuse, right? So find some way to heal yourself, whether that's therapy, meditation, support groups, okay? Any sort of gym, exercise, health and well-being. So find some ways that will put you on a healthy path to heal from that destructive relationship. Because again, you want to make sure that you're keeping yourself a priority and that you're making sure that all of those experiences and thoughts and emotions going back to that self-esteem, loss of sense of self from that destructive relationship begin to heal, because you want to move on to other relationships in your life and try to avoid taking some of those emotions, thoughts, and behaviors from the destructive one and having them bleed into relationships that are healthy in your life. Okay? So with that, I will end here, and I hope that you have gotten some information that might be helpful for you in the future, or helpful now in terms of destructive relationships. I am going to open it up for some questions at the end. And again, please feel free to reach out to us on www.firstlightpsych.com if you have any other questions, any ideas for future webinars, or need any information regarding any of the topics. Okay, so I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you.